Welcome, everyone. My name is Nasan Mahboubi, the director of the Penn Project on the Future of U.S.-China Relations, and I could not be more thrilled to kick off our webinar series with our second cohort of project fellows with today's discussion featuring the climate and environment team of our fellowship cohort. Over the next 6 weeks, each week you will have the opportunity to tune in live on Zoom or later to watch the recording on YouTube of a discussion with our various teams of the second fellowship cohort, in each case, like today, moderated by one of the original cohort of original fellows of the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations. This is a project which tries to contribute to policy discourse about China in the United States by amplifying the perspectives of next-generation scholars and experts on China who are selected through a competitive process. On Monday, we will be issuing the call for applications for our third fellowship cohort, and we will look forward to receiving those applications and announcing our third fellowship cohort very soon. But today, you are getting to hear from our second fellowship cohort. Climate and environment team could not be more thrilled to have this discussion at this consequential time in the beginnings of a new presidential administration. Let me invite them all on stage to briefly introduce them, and then we will get today's discussion started. You see on screen Professor Joanna Lewis of Georgetown University, Professor Michael Davidson of the University of California, San Diego, and Kate Logan of the Asia Society Policy Institute. They are all fellows of the second fellowship cohort. You can read the papers they have written for the project on our website, and I believe the link is being shared in the chat here. For those of you who are not having access to the chat, please make sure to go to the policy paper section of the website of the Penn Project on the Future of U.S.-China Relations. You can read their papers there, as well as summaries of their findings and recommendations. These papers are currently working papers. They are not final yet, so today's discussion and any feedback they receive as a consequence of today's discussion will be built into the final versions of their papers, findings, and recommendations that we will publish later this spring. And being the moderator for today's discussion is my good friend, Alex Wang, professor at the University of California, Los Angeles Law School, who, like me, was one of the first cohort of fellows, one of our great experts on environmental law, and very, very ready to lead a fantastic discussion among the group. I am going to hand it over to Alex and look forward to listening in like everyone else. Over to you, Alex.
Terrific. Thanks a lot, Nason. Looking forward to this conversation. We have a real all-star cast here on people who've been working very deeply on issues of U.S., China, and climate and clean technologies. Let me set the stage very briefly with a little bit of framing, and then I'm going to pose a series of questions which will allow our panelists to explain a little bit about what's in their papers, but then we're going to move range a little bit more widely and just discuss a lot of things that I think are probably on all of our minds. So just in terms of the framing, I think it's fair to say that we're at a crossroads right now with Trump coming in. I think we've all been trying to grapple with what this means for life in our particular areas. That's very much true in the area of climate and the environment. What's clear now is that the U.S. at the federal level is turning away from climate action. Trump is pulling out of the Paris Agreement, but action is going to continue places like California, where I'm located. China remains the largest emitter in the world, but it's moving forward very rapidly on clean tech development and deployment. We're going to talk a lot about that today. And the geopolitics of this has been getting ever more complicated over the last few years, and promises to get even more complicated. And then there's also the issue of what is the rest of the world doing as They're trying to figure out what is happening within the U.S. and China and the interaction between these two global giants. So, without all of that on the table, let's get into the discussion. So, Michael and Joanna, the two of you wrote papers on the issue of U.S.-China competition on clean technology. So I want to start with the two of you first. And maybe I'll start with Michael first and just ask you to set the stage and tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about this. You make some proposals, for example, something you call reverse technology transfer. Tell us how you're thinking about these issues.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. As you noted, China is rapidly investing in a lot of clean tech. But here at home in the US, we're actually undergoing a manufacturing renaissance in clean tech as well. And so there have been various catalogs of what kind of investments have been put in place since the Inflation Reduction Act have passed, over $40 billion in 2023 in EVs alone. These are significant government supports and essentially industrial policy in the US at a scale we haven't seen ever in clean energy, and what we haven't seen in several generations across other economic sectors. Of course, China is dominant in all global value chains of clean tech. And this is from decades of industrial policy that they've had in place, as well as intense competition for their domestic market, where China accounts for, depending on the measure, around 60% of global clean tech investment. So the situation that the US finds itself is it's entering a very different world than when China entered the clean tech space through industrial policy around 15 years ago or longer. Right now, there are very developed global value chains across major products like EVs, solar, batteries, wind components. There are many competitive and globally competitive firms. And these clean energy technologies, importantly, are in many markets cheaper than their fossil fuel alternatives that they're seeking to replace, as opposed to, say, solar panels 2 decades ago, which were about 20 times more expensive. 10 times more expensive than they were today, 20 years ago. So US is entering a very different world than when China was at sort of leading the charge on this. So add to this many geopolitical challenges between the US and China, which cause all of these elements, which were perhaps global value chains and economic related, to also include some security dimensions. So essentially what we have is that the US is facing a very important decision point. And this is whether or not to continue this manufacturing renaissance in clean technology, and what to do about the world leading Chinese firms and technologies that are now coming here to our shore. And it's important to note that the successes that we've seen in clean technology, cost improvements and performance improvements, have been the result of global flows of capital, of talent, of goods and technology. And the first result is that US consumers have been large beneficiaries of this through these reduced costs, as well as the majority of employment in the clean tech sectors where these technologies have been deployed. The second result that we can see from looking past that, thinking about these global flows, is that tariffs and trade barriers that the US has put up have been largely ineffective at bringing back manufacturing. And in fact, it's these industrial policy supports through the IRA and through others that have led to this renaissance. So just briefly, where do I take this conclusion, and what should the US do at this juncture? I think very simply, the US should reduce trade barriers to clean energy, foreign direct investment and technology use from Chinese firms, so that US can take advantage of some of these world leading technologies through what I and others call reverse technology transfer, since now Chinese firms are really leading the way. We should, of course, consider the security dimensions. So there should be a streamlined vetting process for how these firms and technologies can be used by US communities. It is a rather opaque and patchwork process currently, which would lead to perhaps underinvestment or underutilization of these leading technologies. And there should be a very robust review of the trade measures for clean technology that have been put in place by US authorities over the last 2 decades, considering the various types of measures that have been used and where they're locating in the value chain, et cetera. And I'll close it maybe in the discussion we get into it. I think there is a space for a managed trade approach akin to what we saw with the U.S.-Japan relations in the 80s and 90s as applied to clean technology. And so, yeah, I'll stop there, Alex, but looking forward to the rest of the comments.
Great. Okay. Thanks for that. And that's a great setup for the rest of the discussion as well. Let me turn to Joanna now. Joanna, you also talk about global competition on clean technology. You talk about green industrial policy in the U.S., but you also focus on competition in the global South. So tell us what your main points from your paper are, and feel free also to respond to anything that you heard in Michael's comments as well.
Yeah, thank you. In my paper, I propose ways that U.S. companies can better leverage Chinese innovation, complementing in many ways some of the points that Michael just made. But I also look at the important issue of the impact that U.S.-China competition in the clean energy space is actually having on developing and emerging economies. So just briefly on that first point, I talk about how U.S. policymakers should consider revising the policies that, at the moment, completely exclude Chinese clean energy firms from the U.S. market, particularly in these cases where Chinese involvement can, actually bring direct benefits, to U.S. companies, particularly when they can leverage Chinese innovation in these partnerships. And I think this can also be used to shape the practices of Chinese firms overseas. As you may know, Chinese clean energy companies are very engaged in establishing manufacturing facilities all over the world, but we really aren't part of the conversation here in the United States if we're not sort of allowing a lot of these leading businesses to engage with our private sector as well. And so these partnerships can promote things like transparency guidelines, including for the traceability of supply chain components and compliance with global labor standards. On the second point, given that China's large-scale manufacturing and deployment of clean energy technology has really made these technologies more affordable for the rest of the world, I think it's important to remember that, while we focus a lot on sort of the U.S.-China dynamic, of course, the vast majority of the low carbon technologies we're going to need to achieve global climate goals are going to be deployed in developing and emerging economies. And so, my concern and my argument in the paper is that taking a purely nationalistic approach to climate policy, for example, through green industrial policies that result in the reshoring of, clean energy supply chains, will both slow the low carbon transition and make it more costly. Of course, there are reasons that we still would want to do this, and not just the United States, but many other countries are employing industrial policy to onshore, reshore clean energy manufacturing. But we cannot ignore the impact of doing this on the global deployment of low carbon technology. So in my paper, I talk about how the United States can use our own policy levers to address this issue. I think it's really in our interest to expand clean energy supply chains across the global South, especially among our trade partners and allies, because better diversification means less reliance on China, which is really a security issue. And there's really been bipartisan support for these sorts of measures in the past. But to meet global climate goals, right, a sizable part of the future deployment of clean energy technologies is going to be required in these countries that currently have a minimal to no role in existing global clean energy supply chains, or, in many cases are just involved in sort of extractive industries and not necessarily the higher value added aspects of the supply chain. I talk in my paper about some cases where developing countries have been successful in actually looking, to join the solar supply chain and other areas that have actually brought local jobs, local economic benefit, and then results in global diversification, right, away from sort of just, fully Chinese reliance on these technologies. So I think that even if the United States government's going to be less engaged going forward, I do think that there's a role, particularly for U.S. companies as well as multinational development banks and others, where there's direct U.S. engagement for direct capacity building, particularly in these third countries or countries across the global South. Again, to diversify global clean energy supply chains and not just have this be a sort of direct U.S.-China competitive angle with global repercussions.
Great. So let me ask a follow-up question to the two of you before I turn to Kate. One thing I'm curious is there any daylight between the two of you in terms of how you see the risk? So I would love for you to comment on uh, how do you guys see any sort of difference between the way you guys estimate the risk? And then second, what are the specific areas, if we can get a little more concrete, where you think that what you're proposing is most plausible, right? Because, for example, like the new rules on kind of about the security of software in EVs, I'm not totally sure how they would get the U.S. comfortable with software and data and all of that. So I don't know if that's a particularly tricky area, or do you see other areas that are less tricky? A third aspect of this question I'd like to ask you is what would you ask Chinese companies or Chinese policymakers to do in response to these American concerns? I just got back from 2.5 weeks in China, and it was clear that these measures had companies worried. I was meeting with a lot of lawyers as part of my work, and they were all gearing up to advise companies on how to deal with these measures, and they were really worried about it. And so, is there some way that they can compromise, to sort of help sort of meet reduce the conflicts between the countries? So, either Michael or Joanna, if you'd like to take that. That's a lot, I know, but
Well, I guess I'll kick us off and Joanna can jump in. There may not be that much daylight since Joanna and I and you, Alex, co-authored a paper on some of these risks of decoupling from China and clean tech supply chains. Though I'm sure we can all have a very robust discussion on how things have changed in the last few years. I will note that on the EV side, this was something that we didn't explore in that paper, and has certainly been emerging and is a very complex space, more complicated than the other technologies, I believe. I do not think it's insurmountable. I think that we can look at, for example, how Tesla operates in China. So China faced a very similar situation to what the US was facing, except do not have that many Chinese EVs on the road, whereas China had enormous numbers of US EVs on the road. And the solution there is pretty well known, which is to localize data, to sort of separate how data as an algorithm, particularly AI software, is being used on those vehicles, and that was satisfactory to the Chinese government. Europe is coming up with its own way to address this problem. There's other examples of how data localization have been used from cell phone makers, for example. I think that I think there is a workable solution here, but I agree that it is complex, and it will require a lot of careful thinking around how to structure data controls and privacy controls around users' data.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I think that there are some real differences in how we need to treat different technologies, right? I think, the point that it shouldn't just sort of be a one size fits all, where we just put a complete, blanket exclusion on any Chinese involvement or any Chinese technology in the sector, just because there's so much advanced technology know-how that our companies are just not going to be able to compete globally if they're completely shut out of any kind of exchange or partnership. I've studied a lot of how technology transfer was originally transferred to China in these sectors, right, in sort of the early cases of the wind and solar industry, for example. And many American and European firms had a lot of problems, right? To be fair with sort of how these tech transfers played out. In some cases they were, happy marriages, as we say, and in other cases, there were, they got married in legal disputes and IP theft and worst case situations, right? And so I think we've learned a lot about how you can, put together these agreements that can really be in the benefit, right? Particularly of U.S. companies in this case. So, there are several examples right now where U.S. firms, including, many sort of automakers in Michigan, auto part suppliers, are looking to license technology from Chinese companies. And, if you have a situation where the license, is you have to define the terms of this, right? And, but essentially, if they are not going to be involved in business operations, you're basically handing over whatever the, information needed that's going to sort of benefit the U.S. company, and they have exclusive, use of that, product or whatever it is in the US market, then you're not in a sort of a situation where there can be interference or, sort of overall security concerns. And again, it's really the devil's in the details, but we know how to do this, right? And I think it would just be, again, it's better to take a more nuanced approach to this, and and again, focus on the technologies where there's less risk. The paper Michael referred to, I think there are certainly areas that are going to be more challenging. Any, connected vehicles, anything where you're talking about direct interconnection to electric grids, technology that is going sort of speaking right between the wind turbine and the grid or whatnot, right, that could run into broader concerns with cybersecurity and other areas are going to be more challenging, right? But we also, there's plenty of other areas for technology cooperation that don't run into these issues of either, economic or national security. And again, I think we just need to be smart about how we structure them so that United States firms can benefit. And again, just don't get sort of, shut out of the entire sort of EV or battery industry and these really crucial next generation technologies.
Great. So I'm sure there's a lot more to drill down on there, and for the audience, we're going to save some 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions. So if you want to drill down on any of that, be prepared towards the end. So let me turn to Kate right now. Kate, you had a slightly different focus in your paper. You were looking at the idea of U.S.-China cooperation in green finance. So tell us about your main points, and I'm also curious to hear more about why you chose to frame it in a cooperative framework when many people are talking about competition and those sorts of things. And so let me hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I think my topic sort of flows somewhat logically from some of the topics that Joanna addresses in her paper in terms of gaps in Chinese and US involvement in the global South. So maybe taking a step back and just sort of explaining how the politics of global climate finance got to where we are now and the inflection and needs globally. So at a very basic level, from a climate perspective, there's a couple different things that you need investment for. There's mitigation, which is actually reducing emissions through clean technologies. There's adaptation, which is finance that's going toward different projects and other means of actually helping countries adapt to impacts of a changing climate. And then there's also sort of this third category of loss and damage, which is where countries or other actors or regions have already been impacted so much by climate that there's sort of no going back, but they might receive some degree of finance to sort of make up for that or address those irreversible impacts. So from that perspective, in the context of global climate governance, since the early 90s, there's been this split between developed and developing countries, and sort of core to the UN framework on climate is this idea that there is this obligation or responsibility of developed countries to provide some degree of support for developing countries to help them act on climate. So with this in mind, sort of the first major moment on this was back in 2009 at the Copenhagen Climate Summit, where developed countries agreed to mobilize 100 billion per year in climate finance for developing countries. And then obviously in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was adopted, that was another key step forward with sort of breaking through that divide to a certain extent with all countries putting forward their climate targets. But that made it even clearer what the needs are from developing countries to actually meet their targets. And a number of developing countries, when they put forward their targets, actually put forward both conditional and unconditional targets. So what the target would look like if they didn't receive any finance from international sources, as well as what they might be able to do if they were to actually receive adequate finance toward mitigation and adaptation. So with all of this in mind, in the context of US-China relations, so first of all, within this UN climate framework, China has been categorized as a developing country because that's a really difficult divide to sort of reverse in the context of the way that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted. And there have been certain means of sort of evolving that over time. The Paris Agreement is a good example of that, but that's also something that for a long time has been a key point of contention in the US-China relationship. So for example, in terms of moving forward on US-China climate cooperation, there's sort of been for a long time when the US didn't really have a key means of implementing its domestic target and then finally adopted legislation to do that, China politicized even more this idea that the US was also really behind on contributing its fair share of climate finance. So there's that piece of it. And then from a US perspective, as actors from one hand, we're trying to figure out how to actually get the US to contribute more. This framing sort of came into play in terms of trying to lean into the rising competition with China, especially in third countries, to motivate more climate finance for global South countries. So trying to figure out a framing that would motivate the domestic politics in the US to actually give more finance for global South countries. Part of this was also this idea that China wasn't obligated to contribute. And even though China's emissions were, if you look at it from historical perspective, approaching developed countries, and actually some research has shown that China's actually now exceeded the EU in terms of its cumulative historical emissions over time. So it should sort of take more responsibility, and also China lending more actively to global South countries through the Belt and Road Initiative, Global Development Initiative, and really scaling up its international lending. The US was also really frustrated with this idea that China wasn't obligated under this framework to provide climate finance. So in reality, China was actually giving quite a bit of finance, but most of it was in a format that was leading to debt issues in global South countries. All of that was actually, I would say, just from one perspective, resolved somewhat constructively last year at the UN Climate Conference when countries renegotiated the climate finance goal. And for the first time, it sort of shifted the architecture, and China actually actively disclosed at the beginning of the COP in Baku how much finance it's provided and mobilized for developing countries in a way that it hadn't done so before, that basically puts it on par with the way that developed countries frame their obligations. And if you look at that from a numbers perspective, China's sort of on par with the UK in terms of how much they're providing. But at the same time, it still remains that there's sort of this divide in terms of like the competitive framing from the US-China perspective. So if you look at US-China climate cooperation, it's sort of focused on two aspects. This model that was sort of developed during the Obama years that the Biden administration sort of brought back into play. And the first piece of that is US and China working together to come to some degree of consensus on tense negotiating issues so that they could unlock progress in the negotiations. And then the second piece of that was basically what I sort of refer to as parallel cooperation. So it's initiatives that are trying to motivate parallel action toward progress on each country's domestic targets. But what's missing from that is any sort of action to help third countries make progress on their targets. And at the same time, you see this increasing politicization of US-China competition in third countries. So US has launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, as well as these just energy transition partnerships. And they purposely aim to exclude Chinese actors because US is trying to promote this idea that they have higher standards. And it's sort of been motivated by this overall shift toward US-China competitiveness. But my paper argues that this competitive framework for global finance leaves significant gaps, especially in terms of the gap between overall needs and where we actually are in providing finance. So it prioritizes certain countries, it ignores finance for adaptation, and loss and damage. It doesn't leverage complementarities between the two modes of lending, which Joanna and others have researched and put forth really detailed accounts of, sort of how that complementarities piece could be leveraged. It slows down projects from moving ahead. And in practice, you also see a lack of US actually following through on its commitments to developing countries. So the key barrier, even though a number of scholars have put forward frameworks for better coordination and potentially engagement on climate finance, has been the politics. And that's something we'll probably turn back to in terms of where that sits with the current administration, which is probably much more pessimistic than it did last week. But I think in terms of addressing some of the politics, there's three pieces that I look at. One is sort of how to address some of the high level political divergences. Second is how to create more ground level coordination to come up with pilot projects or test examples that show that coordination and cooperation is possible in practice. And then the third piece is focused on transparency and accountability, and how to move forward on improving access to information on what both China and the US are actually doing in their lending practices in a way that actually helps global South countries meet their needs. So maybe I'll leave it there for now.
Great, thanks so much for that. So let me ask a follow-up question that I'll direct at you, but Joanna and Michael, please feel free to chime in on this. One of the dynamics of the financing, so how should I phrase this? So, last year there was a lot of discussion about this idea of a green Marshall Plan, right? So Brian Deese in Foreign Affairs had proposed this late last year for an American Green Marshall Plan, and there have been Chinese people talking about Green Marshall Plans as a new way to frame kind of Green Belt and Road and that sort of thing. But it seems to me that in the Chinese context, the analogy of the Marshall Plan is much more apt in the sense that you have overcapacity in China, and the financing is then funding all of the Chinese companies who make all of the things like solar, wind, EVs, batteries, that are the basic mature technologies that we need now. And on the U.S. side, the funding, where does the funding go exactly? In the Deese article, he mentioned, you and I have chatted about this a little bit. He mentions kind of advanced nuclear, carbon capture, geothermal, these types of things, which are not the core mature technologies that and low cost technologies that a lot of global South countries need. So I'm curious as to how are you thinking about? It just seems like the environment is so much more favorable for China to really move aggressively on green finance and deployment globally as compared to the U.S. So how do you think about that divide in the broader environment for the two countries?
Certainly. And yeah, I'm definitely curious to hear Joanna's perspective on this as well. So I think, as you pointed out, one of the core shortcomings of the model that Deese proposes in relation to the US is that the US has already sort of lost the clean tech arms race with China, if you frame it in that perspective, on the technologies that will be needed most widely, such as solar, battery storage, electric vehicles for the clean energy transition globally. So in order to actually compete with China effectively, we would have had to do things differently earlier, as Michael and Joanna both pointed out very astutely. But also just if you're a global South country, especially as both the US and EU and developed countries close China out of their markets, China will be looking more and more to the global South for markets to absorb the overcapacity that it's experiencing domestically. So already we see almost half of China's exports going to the global South on solar, wind, and electric vehicles. We had recent research by one of my colleagues looking into these flows and how they're changing over time. So I think certainly the interest is there on the China side. I think the challenge on the China side is how to ensure that these exports to the global South actually help to resolve overcapacity rather than exacerbating it, because I think there is a risk that if overcapacity basically leads some of these clean tech companies in China become less and less profitable, that also eats away at the economic incentive for China to act faster on climate, both domestically and in terms of helping other countries through export. So I think that's sort of an open question. On the US side, it's, as you pointed out, sort of a few niche technologies where the US might be able to leapfrog, but there's not really a key, like a core role for those technologies in the clean energy transition. So I think this is one of the gaps that I think there really needs to be more concerted, active action in terms of cooperation globally, especially on the adaptation side. If you look at the figures, if we don't make enough progress fast on mitigation, the cost of adaptation will far exceed those for mitigation in the near term. And that's something I think, especially over the next few years, as climate progress slows, both for the direction that industrial policy is going in terms of slowing down deployment in the US or EU. If we don't make that progress fast enough, the cost of adaptation by the time that we might have a more climate positive administration back in the US will be much, much higher. So I think the imperative for cooperation in that area will be much bigger. And then also just in terms of the countries that are being prioritized, this model of competition leads a lot of those countries out of play. And I think that's a huge risk, both from an investment as well as a security perspective.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Joanna or Michael, do you want to chime in on that question?
Maybe I would just add, I think that when we think about the role that US or US companies can play in developing countries, it's not realistic to just think about exporting US technology, right? Because for the reasons I discussed earlier, I mean, most of these countries don't want to be reliant on US technology any more than they want to be reliant on Chinese technology. And everyone wants, to be part of these industries and these supply chains in terms of providing direct local economic benefit, jobs, training skilled labor, right? Not just sort of being, again, like a source for extraction or just a place where they're sort of the recipient. And honestly, decades of these projects have shown that if you are just sort of selling these technologies, but not setting up the much broader infrastructure to make sure that there's, a system of people that can maintain them and work there. You're not going to have successes with the transition anyway. So, I think that you have to think about, I think there's certainly a role for the United States, or at least in some future for the United States to play an increased role in these countries. But again, I think it can't just be about exporting our technology. There's very few areas where we, there are some examples where we have sort of more advanced technologies than others, but that list is getting shorter and shorter by the day. And so, I do think it's more about the broader capacity building that we and others can help bring, again, so that you're actually looking for ways to diversify the supply chain in these crucial clean energy industries that will sort of make everyone better off.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Michael, do you want to comment on that at all? Or
I'll just add, and I think it's flows from what Kate and Joanna was saying, was that the real risk for the US is that we protect the US market and US firms so aggressively through trade and investment restrictions, such that our firms do not produce anything that the rest of the world wants at a price that they're willing to pay. They may have a very good time selling US made products domestically because that's the only thing that consumers can get a hold of. But for the rest of the world is not going to be paying large premiums to get US made products. So that's the risk. And so I think the challenge is how do we avoid that risk through smarter global collaboration to accelerate US firms to the leading technology frontier in all of these different technologies.
great. So I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but and I see that Lee Shou has already posed a question in the Q&A. But for others, if you have questions, please do put it in the Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll get to it towards the end of the hour. So I guess it's time probably to turn to the $1 million question, right? With the new Trump 2.0, and what does that mean? I guess in part, some of your comments that you've just made could be construed as highlighting the difficulties if the U.S. were trying to compete on clean energy. But of course, we know that we have a new presidential administration that is really just sort of saying we don't even want to compete on clean tech, and we're going with the old fossil fuel industries. But there's also in the mix, of course, Republican state interest in the Inflation Reduction Act, right? We know that several of them seem to have mentioned to the Trump administration that they don't want to roll back the IRA. So what are, in your view, what is the effect of the Trump election? As much as we can make of it so far, right? There's obviously a lot more to know, and there are a lot of known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And so I throw it to any of you to comment on what do you think Trump 2.0 means for all of this? That was a Donald Rumsfeld reference, by the way, in case anyone didn't catch it.
I'm happy to start, I guess. I think that a lot of what I wrote about in my paper would have been hard to do under a Biden administration or a Harris administration as well, right? So I think that any concern when we're talking about these issues of sort of technology entanglement with China is in many ways a bipartisan issue. Even under the Biden administration, there was not widespread agreement that we should renew the U.S.-China Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement, right, which is the sort of the cornerstone agreement of the U.S.-China relationship, going back to 1979, because it just became so politicized, any, sort of talk of science and technology cooperation. And so, that's certainly not going to get any better during this administration. But I think it's important to realize, like, a lot of these challenges we were sort of grappling with even under the previous Democratic administration. But as you say, I think the main change is that, we know a Trump presidency is less concerned about competing with China specifically in clean energy technologies, still concerned with competing, but more in artificial intelligence and other emerging technology areas, right? But I think even though, we're going to see that sort of at the federal level, many states and companies aren't going to see the low carbon transition to China, just because President Trump doesn't like wind turbines or EVs, right? I think that this is the clean technology train has sort of left the station, as it were, and I think a lot of companies and subnationals, right, are going to continue to move forward in the United States because this is where the economic opportunities are, again, not just for the U.S. market, but globally. And so supply chains are going to continue to be built. They're just going to navigate any new tariffs or, non-tariff barriers, including, any continued localization requirements. But I don't think, all that we're just going to, again, sort of completely cede this to China. I think if any, we certainly will be in a worse situation if we're not sort of using everything that we have to try to build up our competitiveness in these industries. But I do think that there will be ways for this to continue, on several fronts.
Great, thanks. Others?
I can follow Joanna here. So,
Sure.
I mean, I think as you mentioned, Alex, the IRA has a substantial number of Republican supporters because clean tech investment is concentrated in red districts and red states. And there's a very, very notable open letter from a large number of House Republicans to the Speaker to not repeal wholesale the IRA. And I think that those feelings have not changed. I'm sure we do expect some tinkering around what the subsidies and the exact structure of industrial policy. Under the Trump administration, we certainly expect a ratcheting of tensions with China. Trade issues are at the center of those, but I see there's also room for negotiation in trade. Security issues will be very important too, and there's still lots of debate on that. I think in clean tech, what the Trump administration is going to find is that many communities and firms have found it very beneficial to partner with Chinese firms. And that reality is going to force folks in Washington to think about how to structure any emerging restrictions and or trade deals. And I think just to close on the trade deal, in Trump's first term, we saw the phase one trade deal with China, which had some initial supporters and some initial success, but then sort of got caught up by events, most notably the COVID pandemic. And But this was a very clearly a model of managed trade, right? So this is not something anathema to the Trump administration, and this is what the U.S. adopted with Japan across multiple presidents in the 1980s and 90s. So I'm not putting out the possibility that there could be some kind of deal on managing trade in clean tech products, as well as making sure that investment money flowing into the United States, into some of these communities and districts that are seeing some of the benefits of the manufacturing renaissance could be reached between the U.S. and China.
Kate, did you want to chime in, or yeah?
Yeah, I'll just come in quickly. I mean, I think similarly to Joanna, but even more so, the topic that I chose was already extremely difficult under a climate positive administration, but it was one I really wanted to explore because I think it's really, really important. That said, now that Trump has released the executive order pulling the US out of the Paris Agreement, again, there's a specific clause in there that also pauses or ceases or revokes any purported financial commitment made under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then there's also this 90-day pause on any sort of foreign development assistance. So in terms of US support for multilateral climate finance or development finance, from a bilateral perspective, I think expectations are probably going to be pretty low during the Trump administration. I think one potential casualty of that, if we're realistic, is the potential for reforms to the international financial architecture to unlock more finance. And that's something that the US had actually been engaging with China on. And one of the things that I was originally considering when I was doing this research was the fact that the US would host the G20 in 2026. And this could be a really interesting opportunity to leverage from a US-China perspective to sort of multilateralize cooperation on an issue to make more progress globally. I think, I hope there is that the U.S. would retreat from the multilateral system doesn't necessarily, block some of those reforms from moving forward, but that remains to be seen. That said, I think, we'll also probably see a return to more competitive framing in terms of U.S. actually still doing something rather than nothing in terms of our investments on climate and third markets. But I do think that the business perspective and economic perspective really is there. And that's something that obviously Joanna and Michael have really emphasized. There are windows of opportunity within that. Obviously there are still non-state financial institutions, companies, philanthropies, other research institutions and think tanks that are looking at investments in the global South and developing economies and can still interact with Chinese actors and figure out how to leverage coordination and engagement to raise standards. I think there's also some time now maybe to take a step back and figure out, how to better multilateralize climate finance cooperation in a way that leverages the US-China relationship to bring other countries along and move the world along, especially since if we do have a more positive, climate positive administration in the future, like I was saying earlier, the needs on adaptation will be much, much greater. And that's something that is much more difficult at this point in time to have a business case around. So figuring out earlier how to address that and then maybe bring that into play in a US-China perspective is, I think, something that there might be an opportunity around as well.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn to Li Shuo's question, and then any other questions. So I wanted to ask the question about how the rest of the world is dealing with this, right? I think we all realize we're a little bit guilty of what you might call hegemonic thinking. We're always talking about U.S. and China, right? The big global powers, and but of course it's a big world out there, and everyone else is trying to deal with the whiplash of U.S. policy and the geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and China. So, how are you guys thinking about the rest of the world, and what should we pay attention to in terms of how the rest of the world is dealing with all of this? Are there particular parts of the world you think we should really pay attention to, or interesting things you're seeing elsewhere in the world, or anything you'd care to comment on that? I'll leave the question rather broad on that. And yeah, go ahead, John. Yeah.
I'm filling the silence. I think I can't speak to the whole world, right? But I guess a couple issues that I'm tracking. I mean, we haven't talked as much sort of about China's response to everything and sort of what's happening domestically there, and particularly in the context of the international climate negotiations. This is, of course, a very important time where, it's supposed to be, within the next few weeks that countries will be putting forward their next NDC, right, their goals under the Paris Agreement in the lead up to COP30 in Brazil at the end of this year. And so I think it's going to be really important to see how the U.S. announcement to withdraw from Paris, even though everyone knew it was coming, at least, ever since we had the election results, how there could be, either like a sort of positive or negative spillover effects, right? I mean, I think and there's certainly Chinese leadership is sort of evaluating, is this the opportunity for them to play an enhanced leadership role globally by putting forward a very strong NDC, for example, which would be a very strong signal, right, of sort of their commitment to carry the Paris Agreement and the multilateral process forward, whereas, an NDC that's viewed as, less ambitious, I think could also then, have knock-on effects for others to sort of put forward less ambitious targets as well. And then this could potentially sort of jeopardize, the overall success or legitimacy of the agreement. So, and we saw sort of whisperings, when, for example, the Argentinian delegation withdrew from Baku early and, has talked about how they might withdraw from the Paris Agreement as well. I think there's a lot of concern, right, that the worst case scenario would be for this to sort of create this broader global wave, the sort of, climate negative, right, sort of against Kate's climate positive framing, but I don't think that's where we are. So I don't want to scare anyone, but I do think it's going to be important to sort of see what is China's response, and then how does the rest of the world sort of respond to that in these next few crucial months leading up to COP30.
I think maybe picking that up and building on it in terms of geographies that are particularly important, I think the EU really comes into play now that the US is retreating, especially in terms of engaging China, not only on the ambition of its NDC, but also the EU response to China clean tech competition, because the EU has taken a much more pragmatic, data-oriented approach than the US, instead of sort of this one-size-fits-all approach, and to see how that plays out in practice and whether certain lessons can be drawn from the way that the EU handles that piece. I also think Brazil is really important this year. They hosted the G20 last year. They're hosting the COP climate conference where these targets will be highlighted this year. And they play a really interesting bridging role in terms of China and the US. Xi Jinping might go to Brazil because Brazil is also hosting the BRICS conference this year. So just keeping an eye on the way that Brazil diplomacy might be able to leverage their relationship with China vis-a-vis climate, which Brazil is also prioritizing. And then lastly, I think there's an interesting possibility within the BRICS to sort of take some of the more emerging leaders on climate technologies, such as China, Brazil, and Indonesia, and see if there might be possibility for some additional leadership. I think it's difficult with Russia in the mix on the BRICS, but what are the economies that are part of that might be able to do something more leadership oriented? So I'd keep an eye on that as well.
Thank you.
Just really briefly, I think that the rest of the world is not static, as we've noted. All are rethinking their trade and investment relations with China, including as it applies to clean tech, and there's diversity of approaches that are being adopted and lots to learn. I think we're going to see some clear bifurcation in how countries come and regions come to a new arrangement with China. And it basically, in my mind, comes down to the extent to which they prioritize investment, trade, and climate action. So I think in the China-US context, there's moderate interest for investment, there's moderate to weak interest in trade, and there's no interest for climate action at the federal level. China-EU plus G7, I think there's some vocal interest for investment, some moderate interest for trade, and some very strong interest in climate. So I think as a result of that, you're going to see a different equilibrium. And then China and the rest of the world, so outside of EU, G7, I think there's moderate interest for investment, strong interest for trade, and then, of course, some lower interest for climate, respecting development goals. So as a result of that, I think we come to a different equilibrium in those countries and regions with respect compared to EU G7.
Great. That's really helpful as a framework for thinking about it. So I'll end with Li Shuo's question, I think. So Li Shuo says really helpful presentations, and he's really drilling down on some of the earlier discussion to ask us to think about 2030 and where U.S. competitiveness will stand versus China, and how that will affect industrial strategy at that point, right? So he's putting us two years after the end of the Trump administration, and presumably there won't be a third unless there are constitutional changes. But we'll leave that issue aside for now. So what do you all think? 2030 and U.S. competitiveness. Presumably things are going to. I mean, the Trump years presumably are going to hurt the battle for competitiveness, right? And
I'll take debate, Li Shuo.
Okay.
I'll take
Okay.
debate, but
Okay.
I think we're looking at it. So fast forward 5 years. So I think in 2030, across the clean tech sectors we've been talking about, I think there's going to be more diversification geographically. So we're going to have a lot more spread out global value chains across all the major technologies, with Chinese firms, of course, playing a leading role, but not exclusively Chinese firms. I think there is going to continue to be U.S. manufacturing build out in these sectors. So we're going to have more products available domestically. Demand is going to be growing, especially for tech that is already developed and is sort of cost competitive to the alternatives, or has other advantageous properties. I think that there is very likely going to be the risk that I mentioned before, that the U.S. does not export many of these clean technology. And where we do, it's mostly to our stronger allied industrialized countries. It's not competitive globally with China. And I think there's going to be a big question around supply chains of newer technologies that will still be in flux. And so I think we can talk about battery chemistries, electrolyzers, green industry technologies. I think it's a little early for new nuclear to be discussed at that stage, more CCS supply chains. So I think that's a big question, and that's probably what's within the scope of the Trump administration to change.
Great, thanks. Joanna?
I completely agree. And I just would really quickly add, I mean, we are in, of course, the decisive decade when it comes to, getting on a pathway that will not rule out some of the lower sort of climate impact scenarios of where the world might be headed. 2030 has sort of always been the year that we dangle, right? Sort of, we need to do it by then. We're obviously not going to solve it by then, but I think that we are going to be in a sort of a different place politically, not just the United States, but potentially elsewhere, and thinking about, okay, if we haven't been able to make dramatic changes in global carbon emissions trajectories, what are these sort of next set of technologies we need to be thinking seriously about, whether it's carbon removal technologies, looking at other means of sequestration, right? And again, getting into the sort of next generation technology space where, I do think US R&D still has some edge, right? I think we could sort of decide to do a complementary industrial strategy to really, as opposed to competing with China and the places where they already have beat us, right? Look at these next generation technologies where we really have an edge, and again, where the world sort of may need to go to drive decarbonization, in a more substantial way.
Just 30 seconds quickly adding on to what Joanna said. I never thought I'd be the person emphasizing adaptation. Maybe it's my climate anxiety coming out, but I do think that technologies for adaptation are also going to be critical by 2030. I mean, you see things like the fire technology industry in California really rising recently, or getting a lot of time in the limelight. And, we're going to be in a very different place, especially if we're slow walking on the mitigation side now. And that's a space that I think it's still quite nascent. So keep an eye on that as well.
Great, thanks so much. So this was a really excellent conversation. We were able to get down to a greater level of detail, which was really important. And I think this week, all the climate meetings I've been part of, it's been necessary for people to sort of strike a note of optimism, given all that's going on at the federal level. And I think one thing that should be clear from our discussion is that the momentum for clean technology transition is really overwhelming right now globally. And obviously there's something different going on at the federal level in the U.S., but that's not the only game in town. It's an important game, but it's not the only game in town. And so this work will continue. All of us and many, many more in the private sector, in academia and government at the state level, and so on and so forth, will be working on this very hard and pushing things forward. With that, I think I'll hand things back to Nason to kind of close us out. And thanks all to the audience and to our terrific speakers.
Thanks, Alex. And I'm so grateful that you did such a wonderful job moderating this discussion and that you ended on, I think, a positive note. I feel incredibly energized by the quality of this discussion. And that includes for the reasons that you just mentioned, Alex, but also, we've, along with the rest of the second fellowship cohort, we've been on this journey together over the past 10 months, meeting on campus at the University of Pennsylvania back in April of last year, going to China together back in July to do field research essentially on a lot of these ideas, going together to Washington, D.C. in September to road test the earlier versions of these papers and recommendations. And just to hear, the precision and quality of them now in this discussion is really very gratifying, frankly. And I'm so pleased with the discussion. Thank you all so much. Thank you again to Alex for your wonderful job moderating. I do want to mention that this is the first of 6 of these webinars that we will be doing with the entire group of the second fellowship cohort. We will be back here, same time, same place, next week with our trade and competitiveness group. So I hope many of the people who joined today, and thank you for doing that, you'll be interested in that as well. If you think this was a useful conversation, please help us amplify it in all the different ways that you can. Again, the recording, which has been live streamed to YouTube, that link is now the link for the recording. And so we will both put that on our project website and send it out on our platforms, but hopefully others can share it as well. And lastly, but not least, let me thank our producer for today's program, Joyce He, for her exceptional job producing. And we'll just close for now with this. Look forward to continuing the conversation with our trade group next week. Goodbye for now.
Thanks a lot, Nason.